The reason that I think the Darent has got great restoration potential is because the water quality is probably the best in this river that it is for anywhere in the whole of the South East. Just to have a river that has no continuous sewage effluent into it is a very, very precious thing, and that gives you a great foundation for restoration, because the big thing is the water quantity. The river's been managed to prevent it from drying up again, rather than having a really healthy flow that supports a healthy river and a healthy biodiverse aquatic ecology. On the Darent, there's a community that fought for their river, who love their river and want to look after it.
Rivers are easily wounded, writes Robert Macfarlane in his book Is a River Alive? The Darent certainly has been wounded, but he adds that given the chance, they heal themselves with remarkable speed. Will the Darent get that chance? Right now the answer is finely balanced. It could go either way. Dip Into the Darent explores the wounds and the chances that are facing this river that meanders for 21 miles through Kent and joins the Thames near Dartford. And you can't talk about the river without also touching on the animals and plants for which it is home. I'm Jackie Imas, and in this episode I'm talking to Dr Chris Gardner, Head of Science and Partnerships at South East Rivers Trust. He's been professionally involved with the Darent for the past 10 years and, like me, has a particular soft spot for this river. I met him by the river at Ainsford and started by asking him where his love of rivers had originated.
I'm a fishery scientist. I've been working on rivers and with fish for nearly 30 years. That started from growing up in a little village where there were no other children. So me and my brothers just spent all of our time messing about in the river. We used to make these rafts out of planks of wood and lemonade bottles or barrels. And then we started fishing in the river. We used to just go and talk to the fishermen. I love fishing, generated an interest in the environment. So I did an environmental science degree. And then I went to the Environment Agency and I was there for about 16 years all over the country. I did a PhD up in Lincolnshire while I was working there. Did a big study of bream migration, tagged a load of bream with electronic tags and tracked them for 4 years up and down the river with them. Generated a massive data set, 3.1 million fish detections along 40 kilometres of river and 80 bream swimming up and down it for 4 years. And after that I moved to Dorset and I worked on the Hampshire Avon, just focused on one species of fish in one river, and it was salmon in the Hampshire Avon. No one else had a job that was one species of fish on one river, so it was an amazing job. I did that for about 3 years and then ended up at the South East Rivers Trust, where I've been for the last 10 years.
South East Rivers Trust has grown quite a lot, I think, during your time there, not just in people but in reach. It almost seems incredible that you were able to spend so much time with our little river.
I guess the Darent's a bit of a favourite. The Darent was one of the places that I first started to work on when I joined here, and I've always just maintained that involvement with it. I've got a personal connection to the Darent because my dad grew up in Dartford, but also it's just a really nice river. It doesn't suffer from some of the issues that some of the other rivers suffer from, so there's great potential for restoration in the Darent. And I guess I just really got on with members of DRIPS, and there's a community on the river that fought for their river that you don't really get on a lot of the other rivers in our patch. But on the Darent, there's local people who love their river and want to look after it.
You've brought me to a lovely little stretch of the river. Can you describe it and where we are?
We're just downstream of Ainsford Road Bridge and Ford by the cricket pitch. I think the low point of the valley is through the cricket pitch. So when the river floods, the cricket pitch is all underwater. The river's been moved to the side of the valley, so it all runs along these houses here and down to a mill about 500 metres downstream. We've got a project going on at the moment where we're hoping to put the river sort of back into that low point and bypass the mill structure, which is a barrier to fish passage, but also unimpound this upstream section.
When you say unimpound, that sounds like the water isn't going anywhere. Does that have an impact on what we would consider to be the typical characteristics of a chalk stream?
Yeah, exactly. So it should be a natural free-flowing chalk stream habitat. We've got some ranunculus growing here in front of us, but if you go down there and have a look in the deeper, slower, really silty section, there's no ranunculus there. But that also generates a big maintenance issue because silt, sand and gravel and things, they are transported by the river. The faster the flow is, the bigger particles that it can transport. So when it goes down into an impoundment and the water all slows down, those particles drop out. So that upstream impoundment just fills with silt and sand, and then that needs maintaining. Otherwise it then just becomes choked with vegetation and blocks up.
You just mentioned ranunculus, which, by way of explanation, is the aquatic plant that we can see in the water and is also known as water crowfoot. But going back to the impoundments, many of these structures, like mills and ponds, were constructed centuries ago. How come the whole thing hasn't silted up and ground to a halt?
When you would have had an active mill there, the miller's job would have been to carry out maintenance, open all the hatches, flush that section out, get rid of all of that silt and sand so that you've got a fully functional mill pond where you can store the maximum amount of water to keep his mill going, sort of thing. But once you haven't got an active mill there and you haven't got the miller doing that maintenance, it all sort of slows down and degrades.
You introduced yourself earlier as a fisheries scientist. Tell me about fish in the Darent.
There's native brown trout in the River Darent, but there aren't many. They're on their knees really at the moment, which is why we need to do restoration. The river used to have a very healthy brown trout population, but because of the impoundments and physical modification that's happened around the river and its lack of flow impacts the trout's ability to live in the river. But I think the main thing is that they don't have very good spawning success. I think there's 29 mills and there's about 80 barriers to fish migration. All of those barriers, they block fish passage, but what they also do is they really stop natural processes. If you look at this gravel bed in front of us, it's all quite dirty. The dirtiness is because the gravels aren't moving, because we've got a series of impoundments, mills and mill heads and weirs. There isn't water passing through the gravel, so when a trout buries its eggs in the gravel, the water needs to pass over those eggs so they can breathe. If those eggs become smothered in silt and sand, no oxygen gets through the side of the egg and the baby fish inside dies.
You've demonstrated quite well how difficult it is to talk about the Darent without raising the issues it faces. How healthy is the river overall?
There's three sort of building blocks to having a healthy river. There's the quantity of water in the river, there's the quality of that water in the river, and then there's the physical habitat itself. The reason that I think the Darent has got great restoration potential is because the water quality is probably the best in this river that it is for anywhere in the whole of the southeast. It's got very low levels of nutrients, and nutrients are really damaging to biodiversity. So where you get nutrient enrichment, it fuels a process in freshwater called eutrophication. Basically, the more nutrients there are in the river, the less things have to compete for them. So the plants that can use those nutrients the quickest dominate. So where you've got very high levels of nutrients, then you just basically get filamentous algae, can utilise nutrients a lot quicker than everything else, outcompete everything else and smother everything else. And where you lose plant diversity, you then lose all the habitats for the invertebrates and the fish that surround it. The great thing about the Darent is it's got very low levels of nutrients, and the reason it's got very low levels of nutrients is just because it doesn't have a sewage works effluent going into it. The big thing is the water quantity. The river can go very low in a dry summer, so when it gets really low, the water can deoxygenate, but also you're not getting that movement, that flushing of sediment from the gravels and things like that. That's really important, certainly for brown trout.
I'm aware that one reason for these low levels in the river is the amount of water that's being taken out of the underground aquifers to supply water to people's homes. What's being done to address this problem of low flow?
Abstraction was reduced about 30 odd years ago to prevent it drying up like it did in the 70s and the 90s, but since then there have been no reductions, and abstraction has been reduced, but it's been reduced to the point where it's almost like managing the river so it doesn't dry up rather than managing the river so that it's got a healthy flow that supports a healthy river and a healthy biodiverse aquatic ecology.
You've been working with the South East Rivers Trust for the past decade. You must have done quite a few projects in your time. Tell me about a couple.
done quite a few, yeah. I think the first one that I did was a bypass channel up at the village of Sundridge, upstream of Sevenoaks. We delivered a 120 metre long bypass channel around a weir. The weir couldn't be removed in that instance, so we built this nature-like bypass around it. And then I guess the biggest project that we've done on the Darent is right down the other end at Dartford in Central Park. There was an old 60s ballroom, I think it was. That was being knocked down by the council to reconnect the park with the town centre, and next to that ballroom was a big weir, which again created a big impoundment through the park. That was all silted up and really poor chalk stream habitat. And when they demolished the building, they also demolished the weir, which allowed us to then go in and narrow the river and put gravel into it and restore that upstream impoundment. It was a long impoundment, it was about 700 metres, and that's still looking really good today, so yeah, that's good.
The work you described at Dartford opens up fish access close to the mouth of the river. But I know there are some quite significant barriers further upstream. So, for example, fish are definitely going to get stuck at the weir at Horton Kirby. Is there any point in removing selected impoundments if you're not removing them all?
You're talking about migration from the sea into the river there, and so you're talking about sea trout and eels, and there have been a couple of instances of salmon coming into the river recently. For every 100 that go out to sea, 90% of those come back to their home river to spawn, but 10% of them get lost and they'll go into other rivers and they may spawn in other rivers, and that's a natural mechanism that allows gene exchange between rivers. It's not just those fish that go out to sea and come back that we're interested in. Because the river is broken up by these mills, you've probably only got 1 or 2 kilometres per section between mills and between barriers. And so all of the fish that are living in the river are just living in 1 to 2 or 3 kilometres of habitat. So fish like dace and chub and roach that are coarse fish and live in the river, they too need to move around the river. They want to move upstream to spawn, and they need different types of habitats at different times of year. Chub, for example, have been known to migrate 5-10 kilometres upstream, because when they lay their eggs, their offspring, chub larvae and chub fry, are at the will of the river because they're not strong enough to swim against the current. So they will naturally just be displaced downstream. So the fish move upstream to spawn. So it's not just those fish that migrate to the sea and back again that we're interested in, although they are really important.
Let's talk about weirs and trout. Some people argue that we need to keep impoundments along the length of the river to preserve water in the river during a dry summer like the one we've just had. How do you respond to that argument?
We just saw those weirs upstream of Ainsford, outside the Plough pub, and those weirs were put in as a measure to combat the drying up of the river. So basically if you put a weir in, then it holds water there, so it looks like the river hasn't dried up. They address the aesthetics of the river drying up and not actually solving the problem. If you imagine you've got a tap running and it's going down the plug hole, that's the flow of the river. Now if you put a kettle underneath that tap and it slowly fills up and then it overflows, that's basically what a weir is doing. It's temporarily storing water in the river until it overflows and then flows out of the river. While it may be creating a temporary refuge from there not being any water, if the river stops flowing, then that kettle full of water, or the impoundment upstream of a weir, is going to deoxygenate and become stagnant, and the fish will die that found refuge in there in just a few days. So far better would be to have no barriers and no weirs, so that if the river does dry up, then the fish can move and find those areas where there is water, which may be upstream and may be downstream, because the River Darent dries up in a funny way because of the way that the aquifers are abstracted from for drinking water. So if you've got a fully connected system without weirs, then the fish can move around and find where those areas themselves.
Moving on from weirs, I know that your final role at South East Rivers Trust included responsibility for partnerships. Tell me about this aspect of your activities in relation to the Darent.
We've had this great partnership with Kent Wildlife Trust on the landscape recovery project. Kent Wildlife Trust led the bid and we contributed to it as a partner with bringing river expertise. We were one of the first 22 pilot landscape recovery projects in the country. That gave us a serious chunk of cash to really get to know it and make a comprehensive plan from source to sea to address fish passage and habitat quality and build up this programme of river restoration work that we want to deliver over the next 10 years.
That genuinely sounds very exciting for the future of the river. Let's hope DEFRA follows through with continued funding of this. Tell me also about the catchment partnership. What is it and what have you achieved through it?
So the catchment partnership, I guess, was formed maybe 12 years ago. There was a feeling, I think, that what restoration was going on rivers was very much top-down, being done by the Environment Agency and water companies without the involvement of other organisations and local stakeholders and communities. So the catchment-based approach was brought in to try and make it a bit more bottom-up. It's just a forum for everybody to come together, to collaborate and get to know each other and try and work together to deliver improvement to the river. One of the big achievements we've done through the catchment partnership is get abstraction reduction back on the agenda. Abstraction was reduced 30 years ago, but since then climate change has had an effect and the river very nearly dried up in 2018 and 2022, and even before that a normal summer flow doesn't facilitate a healthy river on the Darent. But there was no pressure from the regulator, no willingness or movement from water companies to reduce abstraction. So we had a lot of meetings, some of them quite difficult, talking to the Environment Agency and water companies, and we did secure abstraction reductions from South East Water, Thames Water and SES Water in their latest water resource management plans. And that's the first time that anybody committed to reducing abstraction for 30 years. So that was a huge win for the catchment partnership, but they're planned quite far into the future and we really need more water in the river now. So we've still got a lot of work to do to A, make sure we hold the water companies to those commitments they have in their plans, but also try and accelerate them.
It certainly sounds like there are lots of positives in prospect for the health of the river. There is a threat on the horizon though, isn't there?
There's a proposal for a new sewage works at Sevenoaks that would be discharging treated effluent and potentially storm overflows into the river, and that would be a huge blow.
Can you explain exactly why the discharge of effluent into the river creates problems? After all, it is described as having been treated.
That water is still carrying lots of pollutants like pesticides, pharmaceuticals, but it's also very high in nutrients. So while they take out the toxic chemicals from sewage like ammonia that we all produce in our pee, that's treated and denitrified, but it's then converted to nitrate, to a nutrient that will fuel that eutrophication process. If you're looking at another river like, say, the Great Stour, it's another chalk stream like the Darent, but it's got multiple sewage works going into it and very high levels of nutrients, and it's very eutrophic and it's very dominated by filamentous algae in the summer months. To do restoration on the Great Stour, you've got to do a lot of work to try and address that nutrient load.
On balance, weighing up all these points that we've discussed, how hopeful do you feel about the future health of the Darent?
With the landscape recovery project, if that is funded, then we're going to fix a lot of the physical modification problems. We've got good water quality, so if we can then get some more water quantity back in the river by securing those abstraction reductions, then we're going to have a really, really good, healthy river in about 10, 20 years' time. But we need those abstraction reductions to be brought forward so that it all collides together and we fix all the mills, fix all the fish habitat and put more water in the river and fend off that threat of that sewage works and keep the river as pure as it is today. We're stood here and there's healthy clumps of ranunculus glowing in the river and the water's gin clear. It looks brilliant and we really need to safeguard it in this situation so that future generations can enjoy it like we are today.
My thanks to Chris Gardner for sharing his fascinating insights about the river. Thank you too for listening to this episode of Dip Into The Darent. To find out more about this quirky and beautiful chalk stream, visit the Darent River Preservation Society's website at www.darent-drips.org.uk and ensure you don't miss future episodes by subscribing to the series. Dip Into The Darent was presented and produced by me, Jackie Imas. See you next time.